My name is Claire Matthews. I am 29 and my wedding day almost shattered before it even began. 2 weeks before the ceremony, my father backed out of walking me down the aisle because my sister suddenly planned a lavish promotion party in another city on the same day. It wasn't the first time he chose her over me, but this time the truth behind her event was darker and pettier than I could have imagined. As photos from her glamorous gatherings spread online, a surprising person stepped up to take my father's place, and what unfolded at my reception made every guest stop and stare. What would you do if, on the most important day of your life, family loyalty was tested in front of 100 people? Stay with me because by the end of this story, you might rethink what family really means. And it all began on a warm June morning in Austin, Texas, the air thick with sunlight and the sound of preparations just below my window. The satin hem of my gown brushed against the carpet as I stood by the tall window in the bridal suite watching the late morning sunlight spill across downtown Austin. Below the historic Magnolia Hotel's courtyard was already being dressed for the ceremony. White chairs were lined in neat rows of floral arch going up near the fountain. It was everything I had pictured for months, yet my chest felt tight with a familiar ache. 2 weeks ago, my father Daniel Matthews had promised to walk me down that very aisle. I had clung to the thought through every stressful decision, every seating chart, disaster, believing that moment might stitch back together a bond frayed over years. Then my phone had rung, his voice too casual for the words that followed. He told me Victoria, my older sister, was having a promotion party in Houston the same day and he needed to be there. He said it like it was a matter of logistics, not the choice it really was. I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Dad, my wedding is at 4. You promised." He had sighed, the kind of sigh that told me his mind was already made up. "I'll try to make it for the reception, Claire. But this is a big deal for your sister. She's worked hard for it." The lump in my throat had made it hard to speak. I wanted to ask when I had stopped being someone worth showing up for, but the words stayed trapped. Now, as I watched a vendor carry stacks of champagne flutes across the courtyard, I felt the sting all over again. My maid of honor Danielle knocked gently before stepping in with a garment bag over her arm. She took one look at my face and set the bag down. "He's really not coming, is he?" I shook my head. "Not for the ceremony. He says he'll try for the reception." Danielle pressed her lips together and came to stand beside me. "You deserve better than that." I know I murmured, though knowing didn't make it hurt less. I walked over to the vanity, running my fingers over the smooth surface, trying to focus on the details I could control. The pearl earrings I'd chosen sat in a small velvet box, my something old from Mom. I could almost hear her voice telling me to lift my chin and not let anyone dull my joy today. But it was hard when every time I closed my eyes I saw an empty spot beside me at the start of the aisle. The door creaked open again, and Ethan slipped in, still in his shirt and slacks, holding a to-go cup. "I know it's bad luck," he said with a small smile, "but I couldn't let you go without your coffee." I took it from him, the warmth seeping into my palms, and met his steady gaze. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. He reached for my free hand. "We're still going to have an amazing day. I promise." I managed a smile. "I believe you. But I also know there's going to be a moment when I'll feel it." His thumb brushed over my knuckles. "Then we'll make that moment ours anyway." After he left, Danielle helped me into my robe for hair and makeup. The room buzzed with the hum of curling irons and the faint scent of roses drifting in from the open balcony door. The stylist chatted about the weather, the photographer popped in to confirm the timeline, and for a little while I let myself be swept into the current of activity. Still under the surface, the question pulsed: who would take his place? I thought of Linda, Ethan's mother, kind and gentle but busy with her own preparations. Robert, his father, would be busy escorting Ethan's grandmother. My mind kept circling back to John, Ethan's uncle, who had always treated me like family. The thought was a small comfort, but I hadn't asked him, not yet. I wanted the decision to mean something, not just be about filling an empty spot. By early afternoon, my dress hung ready on the door, ivory lace catching the light. I stood there looking at it, imagining walking toward Ethan, my arm linked with someone who was proud to be there. The ache in my chest eased just enough for me to take a slow breath. No matter what, I would not let this choice my father made rewrite the meaning of my day. There would be time later to decide who stepped into that role. For now I had a wedding to be present for. Somewhere down the hall, music from the string quartet floated up, a soft prelude to the evening ahead. I closed my eyes, letting it wrap around me like a reminder that joy could still belong here. When I opened them again, I reached for the pearl earrings, fastened them, and met my own reflection. I was still the bride. And I would still walk down that aisle with or without him. The last time I wore pearls was at my mother's funeral in 2010. I was 16, sitting in the second row of the chapel in San Antonio, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Margaret Matthews had been the anchor of our family, the one who remembered every recital, every science fair, every dentist appointment. When the cancer took her, it felt like the air in our house changed overnight. Dad was working in Dallas back then, commuting 4 days a week, and when he was home, he was more like a shadow than a presence. That left Victoria at 18 to step into the role of the woman in the house. At first, I thought it meant we would grow closer, sisters leaning on each other. Instead, it became clear she had her own idea of what control meant. She started with small things like deciding what we had for dinner or how the living room was arranged. Then it grew. If I needed new shoes for track, she would tell Dad I already had a pair. When I asked for help with college applications, she told him I was being dramatic about deadlines. Dad, worn thin by work and grief, took her word for everything. The first real crack in my trust came the day of the citywide scholarship awards. I had worked for months, staying up late to perfect my essays, keeping my GPA flawless. I was supposed to walk across that stage with my counselor by my side and my family in the audience. Instead, Dad never showed. Later that night, he told me he had thought the event was canceled. Victoria had mentioned something about me changing my mind. I remember nodding quietly while my chest burned. It was the same on my high school graduation day. I scanned the bleachers as our class filed in looking for him. I spotted Victoria sitting with her friends, but Dad's seat was empty. When I asked later, he said he had to cover an emergency meeting in Dallas. I later overheard him on the phone thanking Victoria for letting him know I didn't mind if he missed it. That night, I cried into my pillow until my throat ached. By the time I turned 17, I understood the pattern. She told him versions of events where I was ungrateful, forgetful, or simply not worth the trouble. He believed her because it was easier than facing the grief he carried. I stopped trying to correct the lies. My focus turned to getting out. The University of Texas at Austin became my escape plan. I poured everything into my applications and worked weekends at a coffee shop to cover what scholarships didn't. When my acceptance letter came, I didn't tell Victoria for 2 days, savoring the secret before it could be twisted into something else. It wasn't until my first semester in Austin that I learned the full extent of her manipulation. I had gone to the bank to set up my own account, finally 18 and independent. The manager mentioned a trust my mother had left in my name. I froze because I had never heard of it. He explained it had been transferred to Victoria the month after Mom passed. The paperwork had my father's signature granting permission on my behalf because I was a minor. I walked out of the bank in a daze, the late afternoon sun glaring off the windshield of my old Toyota. The trust had been meant to help me start my adult life, maybe even buy my first home. It was gone before I could even know it existed. I called Dad that night, my voice shaking. He said he thought Victoria would manage it for both of us. That was the last time I tried to make him see her for who she was. In Austin, I built a life away from the suffocating weight of their alliance. I found friends who knew me as more than the younger sister in Victoria's shadow. I worked 2 part-time jobs and learned how to stretch $50 over a week of groceries. I told myself that distance was enough, that I could keep the worst parts of my family in the rearview mirror. Yet standing here today in this gown, the echo of those years feels closer than ever. The choice my father made 2 weeks ago is only the latest in a long line of decisions that told me where I ranked. The music down the hall changes to a brighter melody and the chatter from the courtyard drifts up. My makeup artist steps back, tilting her head to check her work. "You look beautiful," she says. I nod, offering a small smile in the mirror. On the surface, I do look like a woman about to have the happiest day of her life. but deep down, a quieter truth hums. I learned a long time ago that some absences tell you more than any words could. The knock at the door startles me, and Danielle peeks in again, her phone in hand. The photographer is ready for the first look, she says. I stand smoothing my robe over my lap and take one last glance at the pearls in my ears. My mother's pearls. They feel heavier now, as if carrying all the weight of what was lost and what I chose to leave behind. I follow Danielle into the hallway, the hum of conversation growing louder with each step. When I first moved to Austin for college, my plan was simple. Study hard, graduate on time, and carve out a life that no one in my family could take credit for. I chose communications as my major, partly because I loved the power of words and partly because I knew I could excel. 4 years later, I walked across the stage at the Frank Erwin Center with honors cords around my neck, my name called in the same even tone as hundreds of others, but to me it sounded like a victory bell. No one from my family sat in the stands that day. Instead, I posed for pictures with my roommates, holding my diploma like proof that I could survive on my own. It was a few months after graduation that I met Ethan Carter. I was attending a career development seminar at the Hilton downtown, wearing my best navy dress and carrying a stack of freshly printed resumes. During the coffee break, I found myself next to a tall man with sandy blonde hair, leaning against the refreshment table while stirring cream into his coffee. He glanced over, smiled, and asked if I was enjoying the event. There was something steady about his presence, like he was rooted to the ground while the rest of the room buzzed. We talked about work, about the challenges of starting out in our respective fields. He was a civil engineer with a mid-sized firm in Houston in town to give a presentation on urban infrastructure projects. By the time the next session began, we had traded business cards. That night, he sent me an email saying it was nice to meet someone who actually listened. Our first date was dinner at a small Italian place near the river. Ethan was attentive without being overbearing, the kind of man who asked questions and remembered the answers. Over the next few months, we found reasons to see each other between our busy schedules. He would drive up from Houston on Friday nights, and I would meet him halfway for Sunday brunch when I could. The more I learned about him, the more I realized how different his world was from mine. His parents, Linda and Robert Carter, lived in a spacious brick home in the Woodlands. From the first dinner I attended there, I felt the warmth in how they treated each other. Linda hugged me like she had known me for years, and Robert asked about my work with genuine interest. Even Ethan's younger brother Eric teased him in the way only siblings can, but made sure to include me in every conversation. It was the first time I had been in a family setting where the laughter felt easy and no one was looking for a way to cut someone down. It was at one of those dinners that I met Jonathan Harris. Everyone called him Uncle John, though he was technically Ethan's mother's cousin. A retired English literature professor, he had a gentle wit and an encyclopedic memory for poetry. He noticed I was scanning the shelves in the Carters' living room and asked if I liked Dickinson or Frost better. When I admitted I had always been partial to Mary Oliver, his eyes lit up. From that night on, we would trade book recommendations and snippets of writing over email. John had a way of making me feel seen without prying. He asked about my mother once in a quiet moment when we were washing dishes after a family barbecue. I told him she had passed when I was 16, and he nodded with an understanding that came from somewhere deeper than sympathy. He never pushed for details, but he made sure to check in during holidays, sometimes sending a handwritten card with a line of poetry inside. The more time I spent with the Carters, the more I began to understand the phrase chosen family. It was in the way Linda made sure there was sweet tea in the fridge because she knew I preferred it over soda. It was in how Robert always offered to walk me to my car no matter the weather. It was in how Ethan would lean in during crowded gatherings just to make sure I was comfortable. There was no competition, no subtle power plays, just an open seat at the table. One evening, about a year into dating Ethan, we were invited to a small gathering at John's house. His home was filled with books, framed photographs from his travels, and the faint scent of cedar. After dinner, he pulled out an old leather-bound volume of poetry and read aloud while we sat in the living room. There was something in the cadence of his voice that made me feel both grounded and lifted at the same time. As I drove home with Ethan that night, I found myself smiling without realizing it. He noticed, reached over to take my hand, and said he was glad I fit in with his family. I didn't know how to explain that it was more than fitting in. It was like finding a room in a house I thought had been locked forever and discovering the lights still worked. Months later, as our relationship deepened, I started to picture what it might be like to marry into a family like his. Not because of the house or the stability, but because of the way they showed up for each other without keeping score. It was a foreign concept to me, and yet it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The night Ethan proposed, it was just the two of us on the balcony of a cabin we had rented in Fredericksburg. The air was crisp and the hills stretched dark and quiet under the stars. He handed me a small box, his hands steady, his eyes fixed on mine. When I opened it to see the ring, I thought about all the moments that had led me here, to someone who valued presence over excuses. That was the night I realized something had shifted in me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I was leaning into a future where the people around me wanted to be there. And in that moment, I understood why some families are built by choice, not blood. When Ethan slipped the sapphire ring onto my finger, the cool metal seemed to anchor me to that moment. The stone caught the light from the porch lantern, deep blue with a halo of tiny diamonds that shimmered when I turned my hand. We stayed outside for a long time, my head against his shoulder, the quiet of the Texas hill country wrapping around us. The next morning, I woke to find him making coffee in the little kitchen of the cabin, humming under his breath. I touched the ring again just to make sure it was still there. A week later, I called my father. I rehearsed what I would say, trying to keep my voice steady and hopeful. When he answered, his tone was distracted, as if I had caught him in the middle of something he didn't want to pause. I told him Ethan had proposed and that we were setting a date for the 14th of June 2024 at the historic Whitmore Hotel in Austin. There was a pause, and then he said, "Congratulations, Claire. I'll be there." His voice carried no warmth, no excitement, but I held on to the fact that he had agreed to come, and after I asked, said he would walk me down the aisle. I hung up the phone, telling myself that maybe this was the first step towards something better. Ethan and I spent the next few weeks making lists, touring venues, and debating over menus. The Whitmore was perfect, with its grand ballroom, tall windows, and a courtyard strung with lights. 10 months before the date, we sent out save the date cards, each one carefully addressed. I wrote my father's by hand, adding a note that I couldn't wait for him to be part of the day. Victoria's card went out the same day, sent to her Houston townhouse. I imagined her opening it, maybe even calling to say she was happy for me. 2 weeks later, she called, but it wasn't to congratulate me. She said she wouldn't be able to be a bridesmaid. Her voice was smooth, polite, but distant. She claimed work was taking over her calendar, that travel would be impossible to manage alongside her deadlines. I knew better. Victoria could have made it work if she wanted to. I thanked her for letting me know, the words tasting like chalk in my mouth. When I hung up, I stared at the guest list spread across our kitchen table and felt the old ache in my chest, the one I thought I had buried years ago. Ethan noticed. He came over, wrapped his arms around me, and said we would make it a beautiful day regardless. And for a while, I let myself believe him. We chose our colors, ivory and deep green, and found a florist who could weave wildflowers into the arrangements. I picked my dress on a rainy afternoon with Danielle by my side, the two of us laughing under the hum of the boutique lights. In the quiet moments, though, I kept picturing my father at the end of the aisle waiting for me, and I hoped that maybe for once the moment would mean as much to him as it did to me. One evening in February, Ethan's family invited us over for dinner. Linda asked about the planning, listening intently, offering small suggestions without pushing. Robert joked about learning a father-daughter dance in case Daniel got cold feet. I laughed, but something inside me clenched. It was hard to explain to them that my father's presence at the wedding felt like balancing a fragile glass on a ledge, one wrong move away from shattering. In March, I met my father for coffee in Dallas. It was rare for him to initiate a meeting, so I took it as a good sign. We sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, the morning light slanting across the table. He asked about the wedding plans in a way that sounded like checking items off a list. I told him about the ceremony, the string quartet, the reception menu. He nodded, then asked if Victoria had found a dress yet. I reminded him she wasn't in the wedding party. His eyebrows lifted as if this were news to him, though I knew he had been told. He changed the subject quickly, talking about a new project at work, and I let it go. As spring turned into early summer, I filled my days with fittings, tastings, and last-minute details. Sometimes late at night, I would take the ring off, place it in its box, and trace the outline of the sapphire with my fingertip. It reminded me that this day was about more than family politics. It was about the life Ethan and I were building together. Still, the hope lingered stubborn and persistent that the 14th of June could be more than just a wedding. That maybe it could be a bridge. That maybe my father would finally meet me in the middle. It was a Wednesday afternoon when my phone lit up with Victoria's name. I was in the middle of finalizing the seating chart, sliding place cards around on the dining table like pieces of a fragile puzzle. Her voice was bright, almost giddy, as she told me she had just been promoted to regional director. Before I could offer congratulations, she went on to say she was throwing a celebration at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Houston. She said the date slowly, as if testing how it would sound out loud. June 14th. For a moment, I thought she was joking. When I reminded her that was my wedding day, she laughed lightly and said she knew, but it was the only weekend the venue could fit her in. She promised it would be a short event, that Dad would still be able to make it to Austin in time. I could hear the champagne glasses clinking in the background like the celebration had already begun. That evening I called Dad. I told him what Victoria had said, expecting him to tell me not to worry, that he would never let anything interfere with walking me down the aisle. Instead, he hesitated. He said he would try to make both. The words "try to" landed like a stone in my stomach. I pointed out that Houston and Austin were 3 hours apart, more with traffic. He brushed it off, saying he would figure something out. I felt my voice sharpen as I reminded him of the times he had chosen her over me. The scholarship ceremony he skipped because Victoria had a work event. My college graduation he missed because she had invited him to a weekend retreat. Each memory scraped against me like glass still sharp after all these years. He stayed silent for a moment before saying that this promotion was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her, that being there meant a lot. I asked if my wedding day didn't count as once-in-a-lifetime too. His tone cooled in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. "Claire, this is different. She's worked for this for years," he said, as if the years I had worked toward my own life didn't exist in the same category. Ethan found me pacing in the kitchen, my phone still in my hand. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening the longer I spoke. When I finished, he suggested maybe we could find a way to work around it, but I could tell he hated saying it as much as I hated hearing it. The next morning, I sent Dad an email with the wedding timeline, noting exactly when he would need to be in Austin for the ceremony. He replied a few hours later with one line: "I will do my best." There was no promise in it, no certainty, only the same vague commitment that had disappointed me for years. I tried to throw myself back into wedding prep, but every decision now felt shadowed by the possibility of him not being there. Danielle noticed I was quieter than usual during our brunch date. She reached across the table, covered my hand with hers, and told me that no matter what happened, the people who loved me would be there. I nodded, but the image of my father's empty place at the start of the aisle wouldn't leave my mind. One night in May, I drove to Dallas to see him in person. We sat on his back porch, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass. I told him plainly that I needed to know if he was walking me down the aisle. He looked away toward the fence, tapping his glass against his knee, and said he couldn't give me an answer yet. That was when I understood this wasn't about scheduling or traffic. It was about choosing, and he had already made his choice. On the drive back to Austin, the highway stretched ahead in long, dark lines. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, each word landing harder than the last. By the time I reached the city lights, the hurt had settled into something colder. It wasn't just that he might not be there. It was that once again he had decided where his loyalty lay, and it wasn't with me. Ethan was already in the kitchen when I walked through the door, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filling the air. He looked up from the cutting board, and his smile faltered the moment he saw my face. He didn't ask right away, just set the knife down, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and waited. I told him everything while leaning against the counter, my voice clipped at first, then tumbling faster as the details spilled out. The long drive to Dallas. The way my father's voice went flat when he said he'd try to make it to both events. How try had never been enough, not once in all the years I could remember. Ethan listened, his arms crossed, loosely, eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "That's a lot," he said quietly. "And you're sure it's not just about the party?" "It's never just about the party," I replied. "It's the pattern. It's always been the pattern." We ate dinner with more silence than usual. I pushed roasted carrots around my plate while Ethan tried to fill the space with light conversation, but my mind was stuck on a loop. I kept seeing my father's face, hearing the careful way he said the words, as if softening them might make them hurt less. The next morning, Ethan brought it up again. "You know," he said, "over coffee my mom's been where you are." "Not exactly, but close enough." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He told me how decades ago his mother, Linda's father, had refused to walk her down the aisle because he didn't approve of her choice in husband. "She didn't even tell me that until a couple years ago," Ethan said. "But it was my Uncle John who stepped in. She says it was one of the most meaningful things anyone's ever done for her." I'd met Jonathan Harris at a few Carter family gatherings, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but earned it anyway. He'd been a professor of English literature before retiring, the sort of person who quoted poetry in conversation without sounding pretentious. I remembered him asking me once at a Christmas dinner what book had shaped me the most. No one had ever asked me that before. "Do you think he'd—" "I don't know," I began, hesitant, "even consider doing something like that again." "I think you should ask him," Ethan said without hesitation. "If anyone would understand, it's him." By afternoon, I had worked up the nerve. I sent John a text asking if he had time for coffee the next day. He replied within minutes, suggesting a small cafe on South Congress with brick walls, weathered wooden tables, and the smell of fresh espresso that lingered in the air like a promise. When I arrived, John was already there, reading a paperback so worn the spine was nearly white. He stood to greet me, his handshake warm, his eyes kind but curious. We ordered coffee and sat by the window, the late afternoon sun casting soft light across the table. I didn't circle the point. I told him about my father, about the wedding, about the way the possibility of walking down the aisle alone made my stomach twist. My voice caught once, but I pushed through. John listened without interrupting, his brow furrowed slightly as if cataloging every word. When I finally asked if he would walk me down the aisle, there was no hesitation. "It would be an honor," he said, his voice steady. "I'll be there early, help with whatever you need." No bride should feel alone at that moment. The relief that washed over me was almost dizzying. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. John reached across the table and rested his hand over mine. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become," he said. "And she'd be glad you'll have someone beside you who sees you for who you are." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak right away. When I told Ethan later that night, his smile was quiet but unmistakably proud. He pulled me into his arms and said, "You deserve people who choose you without conditions." The following week, John called to confirm he'd booked a hotel in Austin for the wedding weekend. He mentioned bringing an old friend retired from event coordination who could help manage any last-minute chaos. The confidence in his voice made me feel like the day might actually run smoothly even without my father. From then on, the tight knot of anxiety in my chest loosened. It wasn't gone entirely. I still thought about what it would be like to see my father at the ceremony, to watch him avoid my gaze, but the knowledge that John would be there gave me something solid to hold on to. One evening, while going over the seating chart, I realized I was actually looking forward to that moment. The walk, the music, the feeling of someone steady at my side. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like the right choice all along. That night, I fell asleep quickly, the image of John's reassuring smile replacing the replay of my father's clipped voice. Somewhere in the quiet between wakefulness and dreams, I realized I had stopped wishing my father would change. I had started building the day around the people who already showed up. The sunlight spilled through the curtains before my alarm even went off. For a moment, I lay still, letting the quiet of the early morning settle around me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it expecting a good luck text from one of my bridesmaids, but the sender's name made my stomach tighten. Good luck today. Victoria's party is at 11, hoping to make it to your reception tonight. I read the words twice, then set the phone face down. The weight of them was familiar, another reminder that I was still second on his list, but I refused to let it define the day. I took a long breath, got out of bed, and wrapped myself in the robe hanging on the back of the door. The suite was already buzzing. Danielle was in the corner with a curling iron while Madison unpacked a tray of pastries. The air smelled faintly of hairspray and cinnamon. Morning bride, Danielle called, her voice light. We've got mimosas and croissants. I smiled, letting myself be pulled into their chatter. The stylist arrived soon after setting up her tools while my makeup artist laid out palettes across the desk. I sat by the window, watching the city come alive outside, and let them work. Midway through my hair appointment, Madison glanced at her phone and frowned. Have you seen this? She asked quietly, tilting the screen toward me. It was a photo from Victoria's Instagram posted just minutes ago. A ballroom draped in gold and white champagne towers catching the light. The caption read, "Celebrating success in style." By the time I finished my makeup, more images had surfaced, guests in sequin dresses, trays of oysters, a string quartet in the background. A couple of my college friends texted asking if I'd known about the party. I typed back short replies, keeping my tone neutral. When I stepped into the main room to grab a drink, one of Ethan's cousins glanced up from her phone and said, "Wow, your sister's party looks amazing." She didn't mean harm, but the words landed heavier than she realized. I nodded politely and moved on, telling myself it was just noise. Today was not about competing with her. Late morning brought a knock on the door. When I opened it, John stood there in a crisp navy suit holding a small square box. His smile was warm, the kind that settled my nerves without a word. "I thought you might like to carry this," he said, opening the box to reveal a delicate handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots. The edges were worn soft with time. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She carried it on her wedding day. I've kept it safe ever since. Something old, something blue." My throat tightened. "John, this is... I don't even know what to say." "Just say you'll keep it," he replied. I folded the handkerchief carefully and slipped it into the pocket of my robe for now, knowing it would be tucked into my bouquet later. A few minutes after John left to meet Ethan's family, Linda arrived. She carried a small velvet pouch and handed it to me with a smile. Inside was a silver charm bracelet, each charm a tiny, intricate palm tree. "I've been saving this for someone who needed a reminder of strength," she said. The palm bends in the wind, but it doesn't break. Alongside the bracelet was a slim fountain pen with an engraved barrel. "From my years in design," she explained. "You'll need it for the guest book later." I clasped the bracelet onto my wrist and felt its cool weight settle against my skin. These weren't just gifts, they were pieces of people who had chosen to stand beside me. By early afternoon, the suite was filled with the sound of laughter and the soft clink of champagne glasses. The bridesmaids moved in and out of the adjoining rooms, steamers hissing, zippers sliding into place. I could still sense the ripple of Victoria's party in the air. Someone's phone buzzing with another photo, a whispered comment passed between two guests, but I refused to let it break the surface of my calm. When Danielle helped me step into my dress, the room quieted. The fabric whispered against the floor, the lace sleeves hugging my arms just right. Someone gasped softly, and I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time that day, I felt the weight of what was coming, not the absence, not the comparisons, but the moment itself. John returned just before the photographer arrived. He stood a few feet away, looking me over with a faint smile. "You're ready," he said, and somehow it felt less like a comment on my appearance and more like a confirmation that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I glanced at the bouquet resting on the table. The florist had tucked the handkerchief among the stems, the blue flowers peeking through the ivory roses. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the embroidered edge, and felt a quiet certainty settle over me. There would be time later to think about who didn't show up. Right now, I had a day to live. The air outside was warm but not stifling, the kind of June afternoon Texas sometimes gifts between the heavier waves of heat. A light breeze caught the edge of my veil, brushing it against my cheek as John stepped to my side. His arm was steady, his expression calm, but tinged with something proud. "You ready for this?" he asked softly, his voice just for me. I nodded, the weight of the bouquet in my hands grounding me. The music shifted, the opening notes of the processional floating across the lawn. Rows of white chairs curved toward an arch draped in soft fabric and pale blooms. Beyond it, Ethan stood waiting, his eyes locked on mine even from a distance. We began to walk. The grass felt springy under my heels, each step measured with John's. Guests rose as one, a ripple of color and movement in my periphery. I caught glimpses of familiar faces, some smiling wide, others with tears already glistening. Somewhere near the middle row, I saw Mrs. Carter dabbing her eyes with a tissue, her silver charm bracelet catching the sun. Then my gaze slid toward the front row on my side. The chair at the aisle, the one meant for my father, sat empty. My chest tightened, the space around it seeming to expand in the sunlight. I pulled my focus back to Ethan, willing the moment to stay whole. Halfway down the aisle, I caught sight of a cousin from my father's side, one who had always gravitated toward Victoria at family gatherings. Her lips pressed into a line, eyes flicking from the empty chair to me as if the absence was somehow my doing. I felt the flicker of judgment like a spark on dry kindling, but John's arm remained steady under my hand, and I matched my breath to the slow, deliberate pace. When we reached the arch, John squeezed my hand gently before passing it to Ethan. The warmth of Ethan's fingers wrapped around mine instantly, and something in me loosened. "You look incredible," he whispered, just enough for me to hear. The officiant began speaking, his words weaving the ceremony into the hush of the crowd. I tried to absorb every detail, the faint rustle of the fabric above us, the scent of the flowers, the way Ethan's eyes softened whenever they met mine. When it was time for the vows, I took a deep breath and spoke, not to fill the air with perfect phrases but to let Ethan hear the truth of my heart. I told him about the ways he had brought light into places I hadn't realized were still shadowed. I promised to build a life with him that felt like home no matter where we were. My voice wavered once, but his smile steadied me. Ethan's vows came next. His voice was warm, certain, carrying across the rows without strain. He spoke of patience, of laughter, of choosing each other every day. He promised to guard my dreams as fiercely as his own. By the time he finished, I could hear sniffles scattered through the guests. The ring slid into place, cool against skin warmed by the sun. Then the officiant gave the words we had been waiting for. "You may kiss the bride." Ethan's hands cupped my face, his kiss firm but tender. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound rolling out over the lawn like a wave. For a moment, everything felt wrapped in light, the kind that makes you believe the world might just be kind after all. As we turned to face the guests, the burst of clapping and cheers washed over us. John stood near the front row, his smile broad, and Linda's eyes were shining. The empty chair was still there, but I let my gaze pass over it, quickly landing instead on the faces that had really shown up without condition. We walked back down the aisle together, the petals scattered on the grass brushing against my dress. People reached out to squeeze our hands, to whisper congratulations, to hold us in quick, joyful hugs. The music swelled again, and for a few precious minutes, I let myself believe that the day had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Still, as we reached the edge of the lawn and the sunlight shifted, a quiet space opened in my chest. The beauty of the moment didn't erase the absence, it simply existed alongside it, two truths sharing the same air. The reception hall glowed with soft amber light, the kind that made every surface seem warmer and every glass of champagne sparkle. Laughter carried over the music from the live band, and the scent of roasted chicken and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Ethan and I had barely set our plates down at the sweetheart table when I saw a familiar figure slip in through the side entrance. It was Thomas Reed, my cousin on my father's side, still catching his breath like he had jogged from the parking lot. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket before making his way toward us, pausing every few steps to shake a hand or clap someone's shoulder. When he finally reached our table, he leaned in with a quick hug. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "I had to make a quick stop before coming here." Something in his tone caught my ear. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep it light. He glanced around before answering. "Victoria's thing." I froze for a fraction of a second. You mean her promotion party? Thomas nodded but gave a short laugh almost under his breath. Yeah, if you can call it that. I felt the prickle of curiosity along my neck. What do you mean? He shrugged, pulling a chair closer to join us for a minute. It was just not what she made it sound like. There were maybe 20 people there tops. Mostly from her gym, not her office. And it wasn't at a hotel like she told everyone. Just her apartment. I blinked, picturing the sleek upscale venue she had described when she first called my father. She told Dad it was this big deal, I said carefully. Thomas shook his head. No big deal. No speeches, no manager there. Just a lot of wine and charcuterie boards. Honestly, it felt more like a casual hangout than anything else. Before I could answer, someone tapped me on the shoulder. Samantha, a woman I vaguely recognized from photos with Victoria, smiled politely. Congratulations, Claire. You look beautiful. Thank you, I said, standing to hug her. I didn't expect to see you here. She tilted her head slightly. Well, I ran into Thomas outside and we decided to come over together. I didn't want to miss your big day. That's kind, I said, and meant it. But then she lowered her voice, leaning in. I just have to say, I've worked with Victoria for almost 3 years. There's been no talk of a promotion. None. If there was one, I'd know. The room seemed to narrow around us, the music and chatter fading just enough for her words to land fully. Are you sure? I asked. Samantha's expression was certain. Positive. She's been in the same role since she started. I'm not sure why she'd tell people otherwise. I glanced back at Thomas, who gave me a small knowing nod as if to confirm it. My fingers curled against the satin of my gown, the delicate beading pressing into my palm. Thank you for telling me, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. Enjoy the food, please. They moved toward a nearby table, leaving me with Ethan, who had caught enough of the exchange to raise his brows. What was that about? He asked quietly. I took a sip of water, letting the coolness calm my throat. Just more of the same. Ethan's hand found mine under the table. You don't have to deal with it tonight if you don't want to. I nodded, though my mind was already spinning. If Thomas and Samantha were right, then Victoria had built an entire excuse to skip my wedding on a lie. But there was no point in making a scene without proof. I would not give her the satisfaction of watching me unravel in my own reception. The rest of the evening flowed in a haze of toasts, dancing, and photographs. Guests pulled us into their conversations, complimented the food, asked about our honeymoon plans. I laughed when I was supposed to, smiled when cameras flashed, even let Ethan spin me across the dance floor when the band played our song. But, somewhere under all of it, a quiet pulse of disbelief kept tapping at the edges of my thoughts. When I saw John laughing with Linda near the dessert table, I made my way over, grateful for the familiar anchor. He pressed a plate into my hands, piled high with lemon cake and chocolate truffles. Best part of the night, he said with a grin. I smiled back, letting the sweetness on my tongue push aside the sour taste in my mind, if only for a moment. The truth was there, now sitting between the layers of the day, but I wasn't going to touch it yet. Not until I had something I could hold up to the light without question. Later, as Ethan and I stepped outside for a moment of air, the faint hum of laughter from the reception drifted after us. The night sky above Austin was clear, the city lights soft on the horizon. I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his arm around me be the last thing I focused on. There would be time soon enough to follow the thread of what I'd learned. Tonight I would keep the fabric of this day intact. The reception was winding down when I saw him. My father stood in the doorway, scanning the room as if unsure where to start. The sight of him here after everything sent a complicated wave through me. He wore the same navy suit I had imagined seeing when we walked together down the aisle, except that moment never happened. I stepped away from the conversation I was in and crossed to him. You made it, I said, keeping my tone steady. His smile was faint. Traffic from Houston was rough. I'm glad I caught some of it. Some of it I repeated in my head. Not the vows, not the first kiss, not the walk we were supposed to share. I hesitated, then asked, how was Victoria's party? He blinked, caught off guard. It was fine. Small but important for her. Before I could respond, Thomas appeared at my side like he had been waiting for his cue. He greeted my father politely, then pulled his phone from his pocket. "Claire, you should probably see this," he said, tilting the screen toward me. It was a screenshot of a text conversation. The contact name was Victoria. The message from her read clear as day. If her big day falls apart, maybe she'll finally see she's not the center of the universe. The breath left my chest in a slow, controlled exhale. "When did she send this?" I asked. 2 weeks ago, Thomas said. Right after she called to tell Dad about her promotion. My father frowned, shifting his weight. That doesn't sound like her. Thomas's expression was calm, but his voice was firm. I wouldn't be showing you if I wasn't sure it was her. Before the silence could stretch, a woman I didn't recognize approached with Greg Thompson, one of Ethan's family friends. Greg introduced her as Karen Mitchell, the head of HR at the company where Victoria worked. Karen smiled politely at me, then her gaze moved to my father. I don't want to intrude, but Greg mentioned the story about Victoria's promotion. "I thought you should know there hasn't been one. And this," she said, holding up her phone, "is an email she supposedly sent from her work account announcing it. It's fake. Our IT team confirmed it didn't come from our servers." My father's jaw tightened. "Are you certain?" Positive, Karen replied. "I've managed that department for years. There's no role change, no title change, no salary change." Around us, the nearby guests had quieted, drawn by the change in tone. I could feel their attention settling like a weight on our small circle. My father looked from Karen to Thomas to me. His eyes held the first flicker of uncertainty I had seen all day. "Why would she?" He started, then stopped, shaking his head. Thomas's voice was low, but it carried. "Because she didn't want to be here. And she didn't want you here either." The air between us thickened, full of things unsaid. My father's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, and when he lifted it again, there was a rawness there I hadn't expected. "I didn't know," he said quietly. The music from the band played on, light and romantic, but in our corner of the room it felt out of place. I stood still, feeling the truth settle between us like a stone. My father's shoulders sagged just slightly, the confident posture I'd grown up with bending under the weight of what he was hearing. Guests nearby pretended not to listen, but their sideways glances and the faint hush in their voices told me otherwise. My father must have felt it too, because he straightened as if bracing himself against the exposure. "I thought I was doing right by her," he murmured. "This wasn't about right by her," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "It was about showing up for me." He held my gaze for a long moment, something conflicted moving in his eyes. Then, with a small nod that looked more like surrender than agreement, he stepped back. The conversations around us slowly picked up again, but the air hadn't cleared. I didn't push further. Not yet. The night was still mine, and I wasn't going to let her lies steal what was left of it. My father arrived quietly, as if slipping into the room without wanting to disturb the celebration. For a moment I wondered if I was imagining him there, standing just beyond the cluster of guests near the dessert table, scanning the room as though looking for a safe place to land. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly loosened, and when his eyes found mine, something in his expression faltered. He walked over, hands in his pockets, and stopped a few feet away. I wasn't sure if he'd speak first, but he surprised me. "You look beautiful, Claire. I should have been here from the start." His voice carried none of the defensive edge I'd grown accustomed to, only a quiet heaviness. John, who had been standing near Linda, joined us without hesitation. "Daniel, you know I've always respected your role as her father, but when you weren't there, I wasn't going to let her walk alone." His voice was calm but certain, like it was the simplest truth in the world. My father met John's gaze for a long moment before nodding once. "I appreciate that. More than I can say." Before I could respond, Greg Thompson stepped closer, his timing almost too perfect. "Daniel, I think you should hear this too." He glanced toward Karen Mitchell, who had been quietly speaking with 2 other guests. "Karen, would you mind repeating what you told me?" Karen approached, her professional poise unshaken despite the hum of conversation around us. "I confirmed through our internal channels that no promotion was issued to your daughter at our company. The email she circulated was fabricated, and the recipients she invited were not members of our staff." A ripple passed through the nearby tables. Someone behind me murmured something about integrity, and another voice asked if this was related to the promotion party they'd seen on social media. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're certain I wouldn't bring it up in this setting if I wasn't Karen," said evenly. "And forging corporate communications is a serious matter. There will be consequences." Greg gave a low whistle and glanced toward a pair of guests I recognized from Victoria's so-called professional circle. They exchanged a look, then one of them pulled out his phone. I overheard just enough to catch the words "terminate the contract" and "effective immediately." Across the room, another man was already typing on his phone while his wife scrolled through something with a frown. They whispered together, then closed their tab and left the table without touching the dessert plates in front of them. The tension in the air was tangible now, the shift subtle but undeniable. People who had once spoken of Victoria with admiration were suddenly reevaluating every interaction, every promise she'd made. My clutch buzzed in my hand. I stepped aside and opened the message. "Hope you enjoyed your perfect little show. Don't think this makes you better than me." The words were sharp, defensive, dripping with the kind of false bravado that comes when the walls are closing in. Before I could type a response, the typing bubble appeared, flickered, and disappeared. Then the screen went blank. I tried to reopen our thread only to see the notification. "You can no longer send messages to this contact." She had blocked me. A strange, cool clarity settled over me. It wasn't triumph in the loud public sense, but something steadier, quieter. The performance she had worked so hard to maintain was unraveling, and she was retreating before the crowd could see it collapse completely. John returned with 2 glasses of champagne and handed me one. "Everything all right?" I took a slow sip. "Things are already taking care of themselves." The band shifted into a slow song, the kind meant to pull couples to the dance floor. Ethan appeared at my side, his hand finding mine. "You ready?" "More than ready," I said, my voice steady. As he led me to the center of the floor, I caught sight of my father still speaking with Greg and Karen, his posture stiff, his expression a mix of confusion and something heavier. John joined Linda by the edge of the floor, watching us with the same quiet pride he'd carried all day. Around us, conversations continued, but the undercurrent had changed. Deals were being reconsidered. Calls were being made. The ripples from the truth were spreading far beyond this room, and I didn't have to lift a finger to push them along. Ethan wrapped an arm around my waist as we swayed, the soft hum of the music wrapping us in our own small world. I let my gaze drift over the guests, taking in the shifting alliances, the way people avoided certain glances, the murmurs that followed Karen as she crossed the room. Somewhere in the background, karma had started its work. And for the first time in years, I felt no urge to intervene. It was already in motion, and I could simply let it unfold. When the song ended, Ethan kissed my forehead and whispered something about cake. I laughed, the sound lighter than I expected, and let him guide me toward the table where the knife waited. Behind us, the music picked up again, but my attention lingered for a moment on the far side of the room where my father stood alone watching me. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty. Tonight belonged to the people who had shown up, and no amount of her absence could change that. We left for Italy before sunrise, the city still quiet as the car pulled away from the curb. On the flight, I held Ethan's hand and let sleep come in small waves, the kind that smooth the edges of sharp memories. The Amalfi Coast met us with lemon trees and glittering waterstone stairs that made our calves ache in a good way, and evenings that smelled like salt and basil. We turned off our notifications and let the days stretch long. We swam, we read on a narrow balcony, we learned the names of pastas I had only seen on menus. When a thought about home tried to wedge itself between us, Ethan would point out to the horizon and say, "Look," and I would. Only on the last night did I let the real world back in. My phone blinked, awake to a row of missed calls and voicemails from my father. The oldest message was stilted and formal. The next a little softer, and the most recent one raw, in a way I barely recognized. He said he had been wrong. He said he had chosen the easy story over the true one. He asked for a chance to face me without excuses. I listened more than once, each time feeling a different part of the tight knot inside me loosen and then tighten again. Back in Austin, the heat felt heavier after the sea air. We unpacked and did laundry and put our wedding gifts in neat stacks on the dining table. Late that afternoon, I sat on the couch, the room golden with late sun, and called him. We agreed to meet at a small cafe in San Marcos that weekend. Neutral ground, a place without old grooves for either of us to fall into. He was there before me at a corner table with 2 cups already on the tray. He stood as I walked in, and for a second we just looked at each other the way people do when both are trying to read a map neither of them has seen before. He said I look well, and I said thank you, and we sat. For a while, he stayed with safe questions about Italy, about the food, about the color of the water. Then the words he had been keeping came out in a rush. He said after Mom died, he handed the house and the rhythm of life to Victoria because he did not know how to carry it. He said she became the filter between us, and he let it happen because it made the days easier. He said he had told himself that the distance I kept was normal teenage independence when it was really me protecting myself. He said when he read those texts at the reception and saw the way people looked at him, he felt the ground he stood on tilt. I let him speak. When he stopped, the noise of the espresso machine filled the space between us. I told him I had wanted him at the ceremony not because of tradition, but because I had wanted to believe that we could stand side by side in the light and not fall apart. I told him the hurt was not just this year. It was all the small absences stacked like bricks until they blocked the door. He nodded, eyes on his hands. He said he did not expect forgiveness to be quick, and he did not want the kind that is a word only. He said he wanted to earn trust in small, steady ways without asking me to fix the past for him. He admitted he had not questioned Victoria for years because it was easier to accept her version than to examine his own choices. He said he had already called his doctor to ask for a referral to a therapist, and he would go whether I met with him again or not. I believed him. Not because of the apology itself, but because the shape of it was different. There were no explanations dressed up as reasons. There were only facts and the weight of them. I set boundaries. I told him I would not discuss my private life through anyone else. If he had a question, he would ask me, and if I said I needed time, he would give it. I said there would be no more last-minute maybes that treat my milestones like errands. If he said he would be somewhere for me, he would either show up or give me real notice he could not. I said I would not listen to him compare me to Victoria again, not in praise and not in criticism. He listened and wrote it down in a small notebook like he was afraid of losing the details. He asked if he could see me again in a few weeks. I told him yes, but that the pace would be mine. He accepted that without flinching. When we stood to leave, he asked if he could hug me. I hesitated long enough to feel the old ache, then stepped forward and let it be brief and careful. In the parking lot, he turned back and said he was proud of the woman I had become. For once, the words did not slide off me. They landed and stayed. On the drive home, I rolled the window down and let the warm air tug at my hair. I thought about how a single day can hold both grief and relief, how they can sit at the same table and not cancel each other out. I texted Ethan that I was on my way, and he sent back a heart and a picture of dinner coming together, chopped herbs on the cutting board and a pan simmering on the stove. The next week brought small updates that moved the story forward without my hands on it. Karen sent a brief note to say the internal review at Victoria's company was underway. Thomas texted that a couple of her clients had canceled contracts after learning about the fake email. I did not cheer and I did not gloat. I let the information pass through me and keep going. Some lessons arrive like a hammer and some like a slow tide. Either way they arrive. Ethan and I invited the Carters and John for a quiet dinner at our place the following Friday. I set the table with a mix of new wedding gifts and old dishes that had moved with me through 3 apartments. Linda brought a salad and a bottle of wine she had been saving for us. Robert carried in a pie that made the whole room smell like cinnamon. Eric showed up with a stack of board games and a grin. John arrived last, a small box in his hands. He said it was a little something he had held back on the wedding day because too many gifts make a moment blur. Inside was a slim book of poems with a ribbon tied through the spine. He said he had marked a few pages that felt like the start of a life. We ate and told stories and left the heavy parts in the hallway. At one point, Linda reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same gesture she had made the first time I had dinner there years ago. I met her eyes and felt steady in a way I had not felt in a long time. John asked Ethan to turn down the music and then made a small toast without standing. He said family is a choice you make every day and that the proof is always in who shows up when the room is quiet. No one clapped, we just breathed it in. Later, when the table was a mess of candle stubs and empty plates, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was my father. He said he had booked an appointment with a counselor. He said he had told his sister that if she wanted to speak to me again, it would only be after she apologized to me directly and honestly. He said he knew that might never happen. He said he understood that the consequence belonged to her, not to me. I did not call back that night. I did not need to. The words did not demand an answer. They simply marked a step. Ethan walked me out to the patio when the night had thinned and the cicadas had started their steady song. We sat with our shoulders touching and watched the string lights sway. He asked how I felt now that the noise had settled. I told him I felt like a bridge had been built to the middle and that I could walk out onto it without fear of falling. I told him I finally understood that letting go of the hope that someone will change is sometimes the same as making space for the change to begin. He kissed my temple and said that sounded like a good place to rest for a while. I went to bed with the window cracked and dreamed of water on stone, of lemon trees, of a handkerchief folded into a bouquet. In the morning, I woke before the alarm, the house quiet around me, and I thought of that empty chair at the ceremony and of all the chairs that had not been empty. The picture in my head shifted. The emptiness no longer took up the front row. The faces that had shown up did. If you have ever stood in a moment where the person you expected to be there did not arrive and someone unexpected stepped into the light for you, I would love to hear about it. Share your story in the comments so others can find a piece of their courage in it. If this journey felt true to something you have lived, tap like so it reaches someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe for more stories of family forgiveness and the kind of justice that comes when we choose each other on purpose.